join us. We're even more delighted that yesterday we managed to have a day of talks, which I think went better than the talks between the Conservative Party and the DUP. What we're aiming to do is to develop more close links with the research in the Sean's Centre for Digital Education and us. And what we did yesterday, we found many points of contact, so we'll be working forward to do that. Sean is going to be live streamed, so I will live stream Sean and I'll sit down. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming and not sitting outside in the sun under some of the beautiful trees you've got outside there. It's so gorgeous. So the story I'm going to tell this morning is the story of the rise, decline and death of a social network. And also the trajectory of a research project which started out being one thing, became something radically different and actually ended up being more interesting than we thought it would be even at the start of the project. So this is the story I'm going to tell you about. The research project I'm talking about is a research project to look into the value of Yik Yak for understanding the student experience at the University of Edinburgh. So that is a project, I don't think this is working. That's a project that it's still underway. It finishes in a couple of months from now, and it's a collaborative sort of interdisciplinary project with some colleagues from our School of Informatics, our vet school, and Edina. So the project finishes in July, so I will be writing it up over the summer, so this is a kind of flagrant opportunity to get some input and ideas and kind of feedback on the emergent ideas that have come through this project so that I can write a paper on it over July. And this is the content of what I'm going to try and cover in the next half hour or so, hopefully leaving plenty of time for discussion at the end. I'm going to tell the story of Yik Yak, the social media app Yik Yak, and what I called the Yik Yak disaster. I'll describe the death of this network, but then I'll talk more about why I think we need to care about the death of this particular social network and this particular application, and think about what it implies for building a research agenda around anonymity in higher education, teaching and learning, but possibly also research. So can I just, like a really quick show of hands, is anyone in the room kind of, was anyone in the room a Yik Yak user?
Yes.
Yes.
I heard you talk about network learning.
Oh yeah. You got in there.
Nobody on it.
No, exactly. That's the story. Yeah, that's interesting. But people have heard of it. Yeah, generally. Okay. Well, I'll just summarise quickly what that app was. It was you can see up here, it was a geosocial anonymous networking app. So it was launched in 2013. What was interesting about it was the way in which it allowed users to communicate via short messages to people in their immediate vicinity. And key for this talk that I want to give now and the paper I want to write, it was anonymous. So there were no handles, it was very difficult to trace messages back to individuals. It was an anonymous platform. It was marketed very heavily on university campuses, initially in the US and then increasingly in the UK. And quickly over 2013-14, it became almost ubiquitous across university campuses. And the developers were two guys from one of the universities in California, I can't remember which one, managed to raise multiple millions of dollars venture capital to develop and roll out the platform. So you're probably aware that most of the kind of public kind of perception of Yik Yak was as a platform for hate speech, victimization, bullying. There was a lot of controversy around this app, so much so to the extent that it was banned on within most high schools. But it was never banned on university campuses. But it was a controversial application. Why we thought it was interesting, the team that I was working with at Edinburgh, was that you did get these really candid discussions about what it was like to be a student, ranging everything from mental health to sexual health to politics to assessment timescales to exams to revision to partnerships. So it was, for that reason we thought, because at Edinburgh we were thinking quite deeply about our bad NSS results and what they told us about the student experience at Edinburgh, we thought, well, Yik Yak would be a great place to get some really gritty raw data on that, the kinds of things that students would never say in an NSS survey or a course evaluation survey. They were definitely talking about on Yik Yak, and I'll show you some examples of that. So It was very intensively used at Edinburgh University, so the figure here, we knew that at least 100 original yaks were being posted every hour in our central area during March 2016. So I think that a few things which are really key to what is going to come later in this talk around how it worked. So when Yik Yak was busy, the radius within which you could communicate with other users was about 10 miles. As it got less busy, that radius kind of expanded. So by the end of by the time Yik Yak closed down, we were finding yaks coming into the Edinburgh stream that were generated in Dundee. You know, so, but at its peak, it was really spatially kind of constrained. You could, outside your radius, you could peek into what other communities were saying on Yik Yak. So for example, from Edinburgh, you could peek into what people at Harvard were talking about, but you couldn't post to the Harvard feed. So that was particularly interesting. The community moderation of Yik Yak was actually really good. I'll say a bit more about this later on. You could upvote and downvote individual yaks. And if a yak got more than 5 downvotes, it was automatically deleted from the platform. The students, the users, moderated that community, and it was initially completely anonymous. Well, you'll see what you got. So this is the kind of things that people were saying on Yik Yak. At the back, is it possible to see that? Or shall I read it out? You can see it. Okay, so they would talk about things like lecture capture, things that we want to know about at Edinburgh, because we're rolling it out big time at the moment. They would talk about delays in returning exam results. They would talk about the failures in our direct system. And then really occasionally they'd say something really nice, like so that was the kind of stuff we were getting, and that was why we thought it would be a good kind of way into understanding the student experience. But we also had a kind of another more theoretical kind of drive for this project, which was the kind of the way in which the Yik Yak enacted the space of the campus of Edinburgh University. So if you know Edinburgh, you'll know that we have a central campus, which is where most of our humanities and social science students are. Then slightly out of town, this is the third yak down, we have our science campus, King's Buildings. And a bit further out, we have our School of Medicine, which is at our main hospital at Little France. And then way out in the sticks, we have the vets at Easter Bush, the vet school. So normally a social media application would kind of homogenise the campus. If you think you're working on Facebook or I don't know, Instagram or any of the social media applications that students tend to use, they homogenise the space of the campus. But Yik Yak did something quite different, because the kinds of discussions that were happening, for example, at George Square in the central campus, would have been really quite different from the ones that were happening at King's Buildings. So the campus was, I have a short quote here, the campus was being enacted through the coded space of Yik Yak in a way which re-embedded the kind of disciplinary distinction between community groups. And that to me was really interesting, because there weren't many examples of digital kind of social media apps that actually did that, and we wanted to think about the campus as a space which is produced through practice, not a pre-existing space with a fixed geography. So that was our kind of theoretical perspective on it. We came up with this really, I still think is a really nice research design, and this was last year in February. Our intention was to do some intensive yak collections over a 1 week period at 4 points in the academic year, which you can see up there. And then our colleagues in informatics kind of gathered all the yaks that were being generated through those points of time, and they are in the process now of doing the analysis of those yaks. So I can't unfortunately share any of that data with you yet, but it'll be in the paper. And then we appointed 2 undergraduate research assistants as kind of participant observers. So these were students who were using Yik Yak, knew all about it, were obviously heavily embedded in networks of students who were using Yik Yaks, and they manually collected yaks that were specifically about teaching, learning, and assessment. And then they coded them, and they used qualitative data analysis software to collect and code them and write reflective reports about them. And then we put that up against, we have an annual digital footprint survey at Edinburgh where we ask students about their social media ecologies. So we use some of that data, and then we've just finished a round of interviews with students who were Yik Yak users. So we had these multiple kind of methods kind of converging on this question of what does it mean to yak. But okay, this was our big problem. So when we first started to think about doing this project, Yik Yak was hugely popular. It was in September 2014. It was the third most downloaded app on the App Store in the US. And by the following September, it dropped a bit, but you'd expect that, right? Because most people probably had it on their phones already. And so when people went back to college, they wouldn't necessarily need to re-download it. But then, yes, that was the point at which they raised a lot of venture capital funding to develop and roll out the app. And this is the point at which our research project kicked in, just as it started to go on this trajectory of decline. And it really did significantly decline between 2015 and 2016, to the point that in August 2016, the developers took a disastrous decision to redesign the app, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute, but the kind of ethos driving that redesign was this idea that where they were going to make the world feel small again to the students using it, which when you think that decision was made just post the Brexit kind of vote and just pre the Trump vote, there's this idea that the world, as the borders were closing, these were becoming small, and that was quite interestingly reflected in the trajectory of the app. But things kept dropping, and then I think it was in around December last year, they laid off more than half of their employees, so they were obviously in serious trouble at that point. But just to kind of reflect back to August 2016, which is when they did this disastrous redesign of the app, it was entirely disastrous, and it showed how a couple of app developers could get so wrong the value of what their app was. so from what they did was that from Yik Yak being an entirely anonymous app, they introduced compulsory handles, and they introduced some functionality which enables people using the app to see the people who were in their immediate proximity. So in effect, they completely de-anonymized it. And they tried to reframe it as a place where people make friends. So you can see this campaign that they had up on their website was all about, I found my friend through Yik Yak, I yak because it helps me make friends. I really think this must be faked, because I really don't think there's any way in which the original design of Yik Yak would help people make friends except by chance. So this is what the one of the co-founders of Yik Yak said. Since day one we were very focused on hyperlocal, and anonymity was just a mechanism we used to get people on board. They were so very wrong about that. They thought it was all about the geographical proximity issue, and it was very much about the anonymity issue. And actually we got that wrong as a project team as well, because we, in that focus on space and the enactment of space through Yik Yak, we had assumed that the hyperlocality was the interesting issue. And as it turned out, it really wasn't. What this space was good for was anonymity, and that's what students wanted. So these are yaks captured from the Edinburgh area. So when people got back, to university in September 2016, they were like, "What the hell? What's happened? This is so. I need some anonymous help right now. How did this get so bad? There are no yaks. No one's yakking anymore. It's so sad. What's happened to this community?" There was a real outpouring, obviously not just at Edinburgh, sort of globally. There was a lot of unhappiness. Which, of course, got picked up by the two developers of the app, who, this was a priceless video actually. I imagine they've taken it down now, but if you like to see some fat boys squirming on a sofa, you should, I should say fat boy millionaires squirming on a sofa, you should watch this. Anyway, they basically said, "We're really sorry, we got it completely wrong, we're reversing it." They made it an anonymous platform again. They made handles optional rather than compulsory, and removed some of the other de-anonymizing design decisions they've made. So that was in November. And then Trump was elected, so much hilarity. But this is interesting. This shows what happened during that period of de-anonymization at Edinburgh. Massively dramatic drop, and then it was particularly interesting that it picked up again once it had been re-anonymized to really almost pre-disaster levels. Then there was a slow decline and a dropping off. But you have to bear in mind that those figures are in the context of this, which is a massive drop in numbers of users between 2014 and 2017 globally. So the app was definitely on the decline. So when they switched it back on, when they put the, people were so they were so relieved. It was like students were saying it's the best thing that's ever happened, and it's just in time for revision and exams, which I'll come on to in a minute. And yeah, like, this is anyone from Morning Cuddle. That was a typical kind of Edinburgh yak around there. So, but then 6th of May last month, with a week's notice, they closed down the app and it's gone. From an app, it was valued at 400 million a few years ago and was sold for 1 million. I think they bought some of their, they sell it to Square, bought some of their engineers for $1 million, and that was the end of it. So this is just a little bit of reflection from one of our project research associates, and it's interesting because she says actually no one really cared that much. All the feeds that students were looking at, she said, Vice, BuzzFeed, and so on, didn't say anything about the closure of Yik Yak. This was despite it having been a really seriously useful and well-used community space for students. And when she spoke to people in her network, no one really cared. But I think we do need to care, as I said earlier, and I will just spend the second half of this talk really giving some reasons why I think we should care about the death of this network, and also to think seriously about what the story of Yik Yak tells us about student communities, and particularly about the value of anonymity in online spaces. So I think this, for me, was the first reason to care, was the media representation of Yik Yak, which was, I think, absolutely core to the reason it failed, was this kind of news narrative that was spun about it being a toxic space. So, people that were following this at the time, you would have seen there were bomb threats that were spread on Yik Yak. There were mass shooting threats and so on. There were death threats. There was victimization. Some colleges, not many, banned Yik Yak on campus. There was bullying. There was victimization, and Yik Yak was much criticized for preserving. In most instances, preserving the anonymity of users. So, in the US, to de-anonymize required a court order. So, I guess universities were put in an awkward position of having to decide which crimes on Yik Yak merited a court order and de-anonymization, and which didn't. So, there was a lot of discussion. For example, the feminist group that was victimized on Yik Yak, there was no court order, whereas with some of the bomb threats there were, and people were sent to prison. So there was a lot of media about it, understandably, and of course there was hate speech and there was victimization, there was bullying on Yik Yak, but there was other stuff as well. And I think for me the media representation of what Yik Yak was nothing to do with anything empirical or researched or studied. So there were a few studies that came out which showed actually, yes, of course there's bullying and insulting on Yik Yak, as there is in every student space, but this particular research found that there's no threat, they're mostly benign, and they certainly don't call for a demonization of the entire application. And there was a much bigger piece of research which analysed nearly 2 million yaks from across the US that said that actually this application nurtures the positive aspects of online disinhibition. So we know a classic piece of research from a few years ago that there's benign disinhibition and there's toxic disinhibition, and actually what we saw with Yik Yak, it looks like what we saw from the evidence was much more benign stuff where people were talking about their problems, talking about their emotional experiences. There was much more of that than there was this kind of compulsive, negative, toxic stuff. There were a couple of really interesting pieces of research which helps us sort of think more about the value of anonymity and actually what anonymous social media apps kind of do to community. So the one that looked at 2 million yaks actually also compared them to patterns of usage of Twitter, and found that by one measure of vulgarity and I don't know, toxicity, the number of vulgar words that were used on Yik Yak were really essentially the same as we would find on Twitter. And then another study compared Twitter with Whisper. So I don't know if anyone uses Whisper, but it's not such a student-focused app, but it is a geolocation. it's a geosocial app where people can kind of post anonymously. And that study found that there were much more personal stuff coming through on Whisper, much more people talking about what their wants and their needs and their emotions and their friendships than there was on Twitter. So again, Whisper, as a comparable app, was doing similar kinds of social work online. So these word clouds come from the Savesky paper, and I think this screenshot's important because it shows how the community moderation of Yik Yak was actually really effective. They looked at the most characteristic words that were upvoted. Those are the ones on the left around feelings and emotions and friendships and so on. And then the downvoted ones, all the sexist, kind of anti-feminist, racist ones that did very quickly get downvoted and removed from the system. And this alternative picture of Yik Yak is something that is already starting to come through quite strongly from our research. So our research assistants, our undergraduates, were saying actually people shared their thoughts and feelings, they were supportive of each other, there wasn't a lot of judgment, there was a lot of empathy and understanding of the Edinburgh Yik Yak feed. There was kindness and support and humour, and it helped the feelings, it helped people who were feeling overwhelmed to have that anonymous network doing that work. So I think for me as a research question, I think building an institutional evidence base of our students' social media ecologies is really important and something that we should keep trying to do and keep focusing on. We do at Edinburgh have this Managing Your Digital Footprint project, and this photograph was drawn by one of the students who was part of that project. You know, we know that our students' social media ecologies are complex, they're volatile, they move between platforms a lot, and the picture I imagine at the OU will be entirely different as well, so it would be really interesting to look at OU students' social media ecologies and see how they compare to more conventional on-campus ones. But I think, I feel that institutionally this is something we should keep researching and not just certainly not rely on media representation of these things. So the second set of reasons to care sort of relate to the kind of socio-technical imaginaries we build for ourselves in relation to social media on campus. There are kind of, the argument that I've made here is that certain kinds of work need certain kind of platforms and they need certain kind of imaginaries. So in terms of the kind of work that Yik Yak was doing on campus, there's just some examples again from one of our research associates' report. Students were doing, you know, they would ask each other sort of stupid questions. Can I go abroad with these grades? Is 64% a decent result? Should I do this course? You know, so there was some really sort of pragmatic stuff that was happening in Yik Yak. But there was also, you know, around exam results and when we get our proper grades and so on. But there's also a lot of stuff about mental health and student well-being. So we were finding when Yik Yak, actually right up until the very end of Yik Yak, the day before, almost the day before it closed down, there was a really quite devastating set of exchanges about, started by a student who was considering suicide. But you know, examples like this, people talking openly about depression, there would usually be long threads of responses, kind of supportive stuff, hugs, you know, this is who you should contact, go and talk to someone. You know, where that work happens now, I just don't know, now that Yik Yak has gone. Obviously, you hope that students have face-to-face peer networks and institutional networks through which they can have these discussions, but maybe they don't. Maybe many of them were turning to anonymous spaces to do that in a light touch kind of way. So in terms of the value of anonymity, I think it's maybe useful to distinguish between anonymity and unreachability, which is something that Helen Nissenbaum wrote about some time ago now in the context of the meaning of anonymity in a digital age. She says that where anonymity is acceptable or even necessary is because it offers a safe way for people to act, transact and participate without accountability, without others getting at them and tracking them down or even punishing them. So it may enable people to reach out for help, especially for socially stigmatized problems. And this is really interesting to me, that its value isn't in its capacity to be unnamed, but in its capacity to enable people to be unreachable. and to give them their fair dues, the BBC recommended that this was a value of Yik Yak because they used to run mental health. They ran several mental health kind of events in particular areas using Yik Yak as their medium. So it was being used in very productive ways to do exactly this. But I like this idea of thinking about unreachability and what that might mean in the context of on-campus teaching and student support and off-campus teaching and student support. You know, what value and risk might there be for us in terms of developing unreachability spaces for students? And also in this context, how would that look different at the OU than it would at Edinburgh? So I think the other thing that I mentioned was this need to have a particular set of imaginaries about what we think these technologies do to us socially. What kind of society do we want to enact through our technologies? I like this definition from Jasanoff of the socio-technical imaginary as a collectively held, institutionally stabilised and public performed vision of a desirable future, animated by shared understandings of social life attainable through technology. I think that as a research kind of question to sort of dig deeper into some of the socio-technical imaginaries we have about our students' social lives is really an interesting one. Just reflecting back, anyone here remember the 90s? I mean, yeah, do you remember like in the 90s, like I came into this field around early 2000s, and it was still, these literatures were really formative, you know, this sense of the internet as a Wild West. The socio-technical imaginary at that point was a freedom of kind of a kind of reblossoming of a different kind of democracy, and the value of anonymity was very much part of that. So people like Chester and Gwyn were doing really interesting work on thinking about what anonymity might give us in terms of teaching and learning. But now, you know, we're in this very different socio-technical imaginary, which I think the IBM kind of vision of the classroom that learns you is for me one of the most stark. You know, from this kind of free space of free movement, anonymity and potential, we're now in a socio-technical imaginary which is much more oriented around personalisation, tracking individuals and re-individuation of students through technology. I really like Ben Williamson's work on this. I don't know if anyone has read his paper on computing brains, but he talks specifically about this IBM socio-technical imaginary as being to do with, you know, a certain kind of cognitive code space in which brain-inspired algorithms interact with human cognition to optimize capacities of the human mind. You know, this is how it's being framed as a kind of a post-humanist move, which is towards actually greater individuation, greater monitoring and tracking. So I think we need to think about how do we, if we think anonymity is valuable, or even if we think anonymity might be valuable, what do we need to put in place to make it possible? So Scott and Orliowski's work on, you know, we do tend to think about anonymity as a social phenomenon, but actually it's what they call a dynamic material enactment. It requires specific and ongoing materialization. So I would say that Yik Yak was a specific materialization that enabled anonymity to happen on campus, and now we've lost that. So is there anything we want to do about it? Maybe not, but what scope do we have in our universities to kind of push back, create different kinds of socio-technical imaginaries which restore this sense of its kind of pedagogic, political and pastoral value? That's is it my third or fourth research question? I don't know, there are so many. Okay, so I think this is my last reason to care, and it's a more generic one about building a better understanding of the value of anonymity as an egalitarian kind of structure within community generally, but specifically within a higher education community. And I think for me, one of the striking kind of benefits of anonymity that came out of the Yik Yak study so far is the way that anonymous spaces force us out of our echo chambers and filter bubbles. You know, we know that politics is being entirely reshaped by social media and the sharing of news on social media, and we also know that polarization of users online is a big problem, in that people with different political views don't talk to each other anymore, or if they ever did. So there's research that shows that this is the case. But when you're on an anonymous social media app like Yik Yak, you see everything. You see the hate speech alongside the kind of the radical kind of caring kind of speech. So and that for me is a value of it. I think it was also a big problem for Yik Yak, as I said, in that it was the bad stuff that tend to form the kind of collective opinion of that app. But actually, as a way out of the filter bubble, I think anonymity is very interesting. And there's also this question of where do you perform being a student, and in what digital spaces do students perform what it means to be a student. So I'm sure most people here would have read Neil Selman's work from getting on for 10 years ago now on Facebook, and how students used Facebook as a way of enacting and as a kind of backstage space in which they could complain about their lecturers, complain about their institution, be disruptive, challenging and resistant, and then go in like good students to their morning seminar and act as if everything was fine. So that was really interesting at the time, and he described these different kinds of things that students did on Facebook back in 2009. Students don't do that stuff on Facebook anymore, right? They were doing it on Yik Yak for sure. But I think we know that Facebook has become a space, I mean, it's still used by almost all students at Edinburgh, but we know that it's a space for curated selfhood. It's a space now more for the curation and presentation of a certain kind of selfhood, which this author argues is aligned with a kind of corporate capitalism, which holds us individually accountable for our own biographical projects. So what, again, is there something in there for us to think about in relation to anonymous media as spaces where we can give students to resist what I call campus conformity and filter bubbles and this sort of compulsory visibility of the branded self that has taken over other social media environments. This is my last slide. It's just an attempt to kind of summarise some of where I think we've got to with this, and these are the ideas that I'm hoping to move forward with over the summer as I write up this research, thinking about media representations and our research-based understandings of student social media use, exploring this idea of unreachability and new kinds of socio-technical imaginaries that could work on campus and at a distance, and researching and making these alternative spaces that I've just talked about. So I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I'll stop there, and hopefully there's time for discussion. Yeah, there is. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks for listening. Yes. How much time have we got?
The next session is not due to start till 11:10. So
okay, we've got the next 20 minutes. Okay, great. So has anyone got any questions? I hope so. Yeah.
Thank you, that was fascinating. It took me back to, my PhD was in privacy and multimedia communication, and so I wanted, this sort of brought back, I mean, originally when I was doing my PhD, there was people arguing that privacy was dead because of sharing information, but actually your work on anonymity, so some really interesting stuff about people's need for that sort of privacy, but not necessarily they're not wanting to share. So I think there's some fascinating stuff, and my question was around, have you looked at the panopticon and the social control pressure and the ideas of it? So some of the negativity by the press is our societal need to feel that when you have an identifier, that somehow it's controlling what we say, but actually is that then allowing people not to share? And I think particularly within the OU, that might give us some interesting things with regard to how we view lurkers. We have a lot of identification here of our students, and lurkers, they might be lurking, we value judge them as lurkers, which is a bit negative, but they might be lurking not necessarily because they don't want to contribute, but because they feel this identification of themselves. So my question was around, have you thought about privacy connections and possibly about the lurking and the different types of contributions?
Yeah, and I suppose for me, the thing that I've been thinking about a lot in relation to that is this idea of safe space. What constitutes safe space? Particularly, when Theresa May's response to the recent acts of terrorism was that the internet, we need to remove the safe spaces on the internet for where terrorism is kind of bred, and I think we see that in education as well. What are the safe spaces that we are using within education online, and how do we preserve the value of the safe space? And I think the question of lurking kind of comes into that as well, doesn't it? That lurking is a kind of legitimate way in many contexts of engaging. but how safe are our safe spaces, and how hard do we want to fight for them? Yeah, I think a really interesting set of questions. Yeah.
Really fascinating. And when we designed Future Learn, we went exactly the opposite direction towards having real personas, real names, because we wanted to have a sense of reality and communicating with people who actually existed, not hiding behind pseudonyms. And generally that worked in terms of supporting constructive conversations. So I'm wondering whether there are different sorts of conversations. Conversations around a theme, around a topic, and conversations around expressing yourself. And if there is, then you've said one of the values of that is around being able to reach out to others, which is fine, and reach out for help, reach out if you've got a need. But it's one thing to be able to reach out, it's another to be able to get that help and support back. Did you have evidence that people who were reaching out actually then were helped? I mean, were there dialogues which saw that reaching out being rewarded?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the actual, figures on that yet, but we will have. But certainly from the kind of the gathering of yaks that we've done so far, yes, there's definitely evidence of that. In that the kinds of calls for help that I showed generally tended to have quite a few responses to them, and there was definitely evidence that there was a kind of community there. I mean, I'm not arguing that that anonymity needs to be a big part of every kind of online learning space that we design, but I think it should be part of the ecology. I don't know if Future Learn allows any kind of anonymous space at all.
It doesn't. Deliberately.
Others do. I mean, with Learn, for example, there is the option of anonymous discussion forums, but it's not much used, at least at our place. So I think maybe maybe at one level, all I'm arguing for is a kind of slightly more nuanced kind of thinking about the ecology of different kinds of spaces that we put together for our students, and within that ecology valuing something of anonymity that we've tended to kind of move away from over the last decade. Yeah.
I was wondering if there was any institutional pressure to be monitoring YICYAC and to be responding to students. I mean, clearly some students with pastoral needs. Was there a pressure, and was there a response to that?
I suppose this project was a response to that in a way. There wasn't much, I don't think, when the project started, there wasn't very much understanding of YICYAC. I mean, obviously there was among the students, but not among the staff of the university. And so part of what this project hoped to do was to start to build a set of understandings which would help us address that. Should we have the counselling service routinely be monitoring that space, routinely feeding in advice and support? But I think even though YICYAC's died, I still think that's very much a live question, isn't it? To what is our institutional duty of care towards it within social media? I'd be actually really interested to hear about if you have any policies or practices at the OU around that, because we don't really. Individual academics might monitor certain applications, and there was a lecturer at Durham who became known as the YICYAC lecturer because he was very present in YICYAC and was answering all kinds of student questions, but that was in no way kind of formalised. So I don't have an answer to that, except that it's a really interesting discussion to have. Doug and then Hope.
Thank you. This has been really interesting. It's changed my ideas about anonymity. So that's really fantastic. And my question is about what you did about research ethics, because presumably you couldn't possibly have got permission from the people who posted these things to use them as part of the study.
No. we did have a lot of discussions about ethics, and we did get ethical approval, but it was difficult because you can't. We committed to not using any data that might even slightly kind of reveal who the original poster was. In particular, we were thinking through what would happen if a lot of students were yakking very negatively about a particular lecturer, for example, or a particular programme, and what we would do in that situation. So we had a kind of ethical response to that question as well. But it was difficult. I think partly having our undergraduate research associates was really helpful in terms of keeping us right on the ethics, because they gave us a lot of guidance as to what they would find acceptable as undergraduates and how they felt that we should be approaching the ethics. So that was really helpful. So yeah, but I think with so many of these social media and digital projects, the ethics are really so quickly. It's really But we did our best, and I think as we write this up, we're going to have to revisit the ethical commitments we made at the start of the project to think about them again. Yeah.
I think that bit about having insight into the community and the norms, that is really interesting and valuable, both for all aspects of it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Fascinating talk. As much for what you couldn't say as what you could. So one thing which I'd like to understand a bit more about is when you introduce anonymity into a platform, do you see different behavior because there are different people using it, or whether the same people use it in different ways? And I guess in an anonymous platform, this is a hard question to answer. But you said you did some interviews.
Yeah, we don't. They've just literally just happened. I haven't seen the transcripts yet, so I really hope they'll reveal something of that. But we haven't. That's a really interesting research question to address in another study, isn't it? It's whether there are methods that would let you get a sense of that. Our feeling was that after the what I call the Yik Yak disaster happened, there were fewer responses to original Yak, so that the pattern of communication had changed a bit after that de-anonymization happened, and then de-anonymization was reintroduced. It had changed the kinds of things that were happening on Yik Yak, but we don't have any data which could answer the question that you just posed. It'd be interesting to do some more research. Yeah.
So you're now in sort of post Yik Yak era. So where have people gone?
Yeah, we don't really know. I mean, Snapchat. Students seem to be using a lot more Snapchat. During the period of time when Yik Yak, de-anonymized, people were looking to an application called Yodel, which was I think it might be German. There's a lot of, but it was very similar to Yik Yak, but it was never very much used. I think part of the success of Yik Yak has not been necessarily to do with the functionality of the app, but the extent to which it was marketed specifically on campus, and there were no equivalent anonymous geosocial apps that were marketed on campus in the way that Yik Yak was. So nobody seemed to be going on to Whisper, for example, which you might have expected them to. There's a thing now called Sprout, which some people, or Spout, which some people seem to be using, but really nothing has. And this has been a question we've been addressing throughout the whole project. And our research associates have been out there, kind of doing their best to find out where students are having these discussions, and really not coming up with any answer to it. They're on Facebook to a large extent. They use Instagram and they use Snapchat, but none of those apps do what Yik Yak did.
So a lot of the examples we've seen have been around kind of social and support and companionship, I suppose. I'm wondering about focusing on the learning aspect of it. So I guess there were a few examples around that. I'm thinking back to in face-to-face settings where people are beginning to use, they have been for a while, these little gadgets where you can ask anonymous questions. So that seems like the sort of thing that could happen here quite nicely. So students who are a bit nervous of, I don't know, showing their ignorance or asking a stupid question, that's a phrase that students often use, I don't want to ask a stupid question. Do you think that's relevant here to any degree?
Yeah, we certainly saw lots of people asking stupid questions, but it was generally, often they were kind of administrative rather than content related. So that's a really good point. Actually, that's something we should dig into as we go back to the data, is looking at any content related yaks that may have been being generated within specific lectures, for example. My impression at this point is that there isn't very much of that. There was lots of stuff about lectures, but it was generally around establishing social norms within lectures. So you'd be amazed at how much discussion there was about things, about people who start to pack their bag before the lecturer is finished. There was so much anger on Yik Yak about that. So that kind of thing took me by surprise. The teaching learning related stuff was generally more that kind of thing. But yeah, we'll need to dig back into the data of that, but I don't think there was a great deal, and it would probably have been, if you had a very switched on lecturer that knew that students were using Yik Yak and could have suggested they use Yik Yak to post anonymous questions about the content of the lecture, that it would probably, my hunch is it would have taken one of the lecturers or the teachers to kind of start that. But yeah, good question.
Amy Collier visited us in Edinburgh a few months ago, and she was talking about some of the things that were happening in the kind of post-Trump landscape in relation to ideas about what students needed, and particularly vulnerable students who were, for example, might have their immigration status questioned. And she was talking about this concept of digital sanctuary as a kind of really important thing that universities needed to take account of, especially now. And it seems to me to be a related set of questions around, like I remember, some of the conversations that we were having about that were about about deliberately forgetting certain things about students, or deleting stuff, and it seems like there's a kind of formal educational, even administrative dimension to this thinking about anonymity that might come to be quite important in the next few years, which is sort of the flip side, or the different side of what students are choosing to do in their own time. And I wondered if any of that has kind of come up peripherally in relation to this project, or if you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I think digital sanctuary is a really nice way to think about it, and you can imagine discussions and some candid questions around immigration status, for example, happening in a space like Yik Yak that wouldn't happen elsewhere. I think a lot of that discussion has happened at Edinburgh around our kind of in the context of our learning analytics policy, and the students' concerns around that it's kind of removing. It's going to have negative effects on the use of personal data, which isn't the case, but there is a kind of definitely a level of concern from students around that. But I think that's a really good point. And then what might we like to do as institutions to build digital sanctuaries for students? A really good question. Thanks. Yeah.
Hiya. Thanks. I'm Leslie, I'm one of the postgraduate students here.
Yeah.
Just really interesting, that whole idea of digital sanctuary as well, because you were also asking with regard about challenges here at the OU. So the OU obviously has a particular challenge because it's a non-campus university, and it's got a whole bunch of postgraduate research students on it who aren't able to share in the normal buzz of a campus university.
Yeah.
So there's lots of challenges around that we're kind of all talking about and thinking about at the moment, and thinking about even a physical space. There's no physical space in the university where postgraduate research students can go to for a sanctuary. And there's the graduate school network, which isn't really used for a discussion forum, and there are various different Facebook groups all over the place. So just as what you're saying is just sparking off ideas in my brain for a digital sanctuary and a nice space, that may help all various different students across the OU who need that help, especially mental health and just information finding and support when they come to Milton Keynes and all this kind of thing. It's just sparking off ideas, really.
Yeah, that is interesting. You make me think about what the value of anonymity.
Yeah.
Because you could have a digital sanctuary that wasn't anonymous.
Yes.
It was sanctuary in some other kind of way, and maybe for distance students that kind of sanctuary would be more useful than it would be for on-campus students, where perhaps anonymity would be more of an issue, or the desire for anonymity would be more felt. I don't know.
Yes. It's a really interesting question.
Really interesting question, yeah,
Isn't it?
really interesting.
I was wondering, so it's really fascinating and fantastic depth of work as well. One of the questions that kind of keeps coming up with the social media, use of social media by students, is that one of the aspects of it is that it's the use of technology that's outside of the control of the institution. It's not lecture driven or institutionally supported, if you like, and that has huge benefits. It enables people to participate in a way that's different. But nonetheless, it's kind of outside of what the university and perhaps what educators can do or influence. So it's kind of, what are the sort of design lessons, or what are the things coming out of this that maybe we should try to think about when we are looking at social media policy and trying to consider, well, what provision can we do? Is there an aspect here where we should step away and actually let people get on with it, or is there parts here where maybe there's things that we should promote or try to encourage, or practices that we should encourage? I mean, sort of the anonymity and hate posts, shouldn't be on the same side of the coin. There's elements there that there's benefits. So is there stuff coming from this that maybe in a more positive way we can say, okay, Yik Yak might have gone, but what are the design features of that we might want to look for in other things that come along in the future?
Yeah, yes, very much so. I think again the geosocial aspect of it, I think is very interesting to us at Edinburgh. Probably be less so generally for you, although I don't know if there's a critical mass of students in a particular area, it could be really useful. Those kinds of things are really interesting. And I think it also connects to the question that came earlier around institutional duty of care as well. For example, when we were doing our first round of yak gathering, we were seeing yaks from people requiring counselling support, but they were coming from the Holyrood campus, and they actually no, that's not right. They were coming from the Little France campus right out of town. So our student services and counselling services based in the central area. So even if you'd had someone from counselling monitoring Yik Yak, there's no way they would have been picking up things from the med school or the vets. So you're kind of thinking, well, I mean, Yik Yak's died, but if we wanted to bring back some kind of geosocial networking like that, it could have potentially quite profound implications for how we design support services and so on. But I do think that there was quite a lot of value in that geosocial aspect to it, as well as in the anonymity aspect. So yeah, really interesting. Yeah.
I'm still thinking about the relationship between radically anonymous and radically open networks. I've just joined a geosocial network, which is one for our local residents community. And again, they've made a decision to be radically open, so everybody uses their real names, their real addresses. And what's happened is, again, it's generally supportive, and it's talking about community and community problems, community issues. I wonder if anonymous networks then breed a focus on oneself and one's personal issues and how they can be solved, and very open networks about one's community, both of which are valuable, both of which have a need, but how they can sit alongside each other.
I think you're probably right. I think so. Anonymous networks were more focused on individuals' particular needs or particular things that they wanted to say at particular times. But I think that they what's the word? They're more volatile. So yes, you can't build a community in the same way on an anonymous application, but you can have this very kind of what's the word? Rapid fire, important discussions happening that were very transient, and they would then disappear, or maybe they'd spring up a few days later elsewhere, but you wouldn't know if it was even the same people you were talking to. So it comes back to that sort of socio-technical imaginary and the kind of socio-materiality of anonymity, really, isn't it? It's kind of how do we work those different kind of materialities for different ends.
Exactly.
And I think the end we would achieve through anonymity would be very different from what we'd achieve through open kind of tag stuff around the networks. It's interesting. Yeah.
I think this is a nice pause which we can thank Sian for a fascinating, stimulating talk and for launching our conference.
Thank you.